Shabbat Shalom. Last week, I was video conferencing with my parents in Israel, in Jerusalem, and I could see they were walking in the street and the sun was out, and they were not wearing gloves or a hat or a heavy winter coat. They said to me, "Spring is in the air." I looked outside, it was gray, a few inches of snow, 10 degrees. So Tu B'Shvat makes a lot more sense in Israel than it does in Chicago. And obviously our planting season and our flowering season starts a little bit later. But it's true, in Israel, the first almond blossoms appear around this time. You really see them around. And one sees the power of new life beginning to take hold. For us, it happens probably closer to Pesach, the Passover, and maybe it's even more remarkable when we see it because of how long we've been waiting for it. And on the other side, in Israel, Pesach is the end of the period. By Pesach, everything is in full bloom, everything is beautiful and flowering and flowing. And it is interesting that this story that we read, the story of the parting of the sea and of the walking through the sea to freedom, we read twice a year. One we read around Tu B'Shvat, another time we read around Passover. And what is this story about? On one hand, it's a story that is about the unstoppable divine life force that comes to bring new life despite all the obstacles and despite all the barriers that come in its way. And looking at our world, it's not hard to see all the barriers are in the way of that divine life force. And in our nation, all the issues that are so inscrutably complex and interlinked, and in our own lives. And so what is the crossing of the Red Sea about? This is a moment where, out of all the impossible slavery that they were mired in, a new life came to the Jewish nation. As we often like to describe the sea, they were being freed, but the imagery couldn't be more deliberate. They were walking through a birth canal. They were walking through a birth canal and emerged on the other side, completely new chapter, completely new moment in their existence. And the experience is considered so lofty and so powerful because it really was a moment of transition into a whole new way of being, out of slavery, which had been all they'd known for so many generations, and to the unknown. But we know to being to Sinai, to receiving the Torah, and being God's treasured nation. And of course, we know it takes them many years until they would understand what that would mean, until slavery would fully be out of their system, and to 40 years in the desert, and then hundreds of years to truly make it all theirs. But this was really the moment. This is where the divine life forces came and lifted all the waters and allowed them to follow through and discover a new purpose, discover a new place. And part of the imagery of all of this episode is that even the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh, could do nothing to stop that force of new life. And even the most powerful army in the world could do nothing to stop that power of new life that was just coming through. When they encamped in front of the sea, there was that moment, well, are we really going to make it or not? Because they saw all of Egypt coming back to get them, and Pharaoh, and they thought, okay, we had the winds on our back, but now the wind is gone. But then the greatest miracle of all happened, pushing it all through, and all their taskmasters were cast aside. And one of the phrases the Torah uses over and over in this passage is that God will have His glory over them. God will have His glory over the Egyptians. And so He says to Moses, I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all of his warriors. So what does it mean? Sforno, the Italian commentator, he says, well, the Egyptians would see the power and might of the divine and all the miracles that they were pushing through, and they would realize finally everything that had happened, and they would repent. And that God's glory was more powerful than any human being, and nothing could withstand it. And this is the promise. This is the promise that eventually, maybe not in quite as an overt way, God and the divine life force will fulfill its function. And sometimes it looks as if nothing is happening and everything is just stuck the way it is, but then it all comes to life, and the waters of the sea part, and new life is pushed in through. So Rashi teaches that the unstoppable life force is not just destructive, removing the obstacles in Pharaoh, but he's also saying, as the children of Israel are singing, Ozi v'zi matya, and the God is their God, Eli, God is my God, they're also saying that God is not only the destructive power, but also the sustaining power of the universe. God, that force of sustaining and of bringing new life, is not just removing the obstacles, but also bringing that life to flower. And I think we can say that we also witness that. Nations that are stuck suddenly blossom, international stalemates dissolve into peace. The paper is only good for 10 years, but at least it's good for a little time. Who could have imagined the Soviet Union dissolving as it did? And civilizations rise up out of nowhere, and suddenly they're full of vitality and life force, and they have something to give to the world. Never perfect, but we see it so clearly in history, a new way in vision. Maybe India, under the British, one could have seen it was a broken nation of many little princedoms and little territories, a national identity hard to imagine. But then it found independence, and despite all its myriad of problems and tensions between Muslims and Indian, with the help of inspired leadership, they were able to find that wind, and suddenly rising and rising. And despite the poverty and the systemic issues that are so deep there, and the corruption, I read a report last week that many believe that India will be the third most powerful country economically in the world by 2050. And this own nation, our nation, everything that it's done in 250 years, how it's just been swept up in that life force to give to the world. Civilizations rising up, and that new power coming, bringing vitality and that piece of something new into the world. And so the divine life force finds its way, this is the promise, and works its way through all of it, eventually bringing new life and bursting through the earth. We can also say this is what happens to all of us, to human beings. For we too go through moments and we feel that Egypt is running after us with all of its chariots. And we wonder, are we going to make this final hurdle? How are we going to get out of this? Or sometimes it's the opposite. There's nothing happening. It's the exact same day after day. But then suddenly it all comes to life, and a whole new direction opens up. And we're traveling faster than we've ever traveled. And we're crossing the sea, and the whole life canal births us into a new place, a new professional direction, a new place, a new field of interests and relationships, a new phase of life. That life force gives us the wings and we climb higher. And it's why Pesach, of course, is the holiday of spring, because spring is when nature is all guided to that place. And its story is the story of the power of that life force and how it does work its way to freedom and fulfillment. And as we say, Adam hu etz hasadeh, that a person is like the tree of the field. And we're also like that tree. We go through our cycles. We have that times when our tree is growing with presence, and when it's the other cycle. And then winter comes again, but then the temperatures rise and the ground unfreezes, and there we are again, life erupts. And so in Israel, the first signs of spring are right now. This is when we begin to see that process. Tu B'Shvat marks the very first part of it. And maybe we can say even in Chicago, while we're far away from flowering and blossoms, this is a time when you can plant, at least in your own self, the beginning of something that you can harvest later on. that will burst into life in the months ahead. And we read this story now, not only of Pesach, to remind us of the different stages and to remind us that the divine life force always finds a way, even in the dead of winter. And how matter and how complicated it seems we've made the issue for our planet, how complicated we've made it for our own selves, for our families, for our nation, that we have to find a measure of faith that with all of our efforts, all of our heart and soul, we can bring new life bursting forth from the earth. And even though the earth may appear frozen and spring very far off, but it's nonetheless there, waiting for just the right moment, and then it's unstoppable in its vibrancy and where it will take us. And our measure of faith, what is required of us, is to continue to carry that hope within us, and that will be fulfilled as a people, as a nation, as a world. And that once we fulfilled it, perhaps we'll go through another phase, and we'll once again find our place. We'll just be part of the ever-pulsating rhythm of the universe, the rhythm that animates all life. Shabbat Shalom.